So now I will be presenting. Like I said, my name is Grace Hart, and I'm also in the Computational Clinical Science Lab. And today I'm really excited to be talking to you about some work we recently completed on death concepts using natural language processing. So as many of us know, suicide is a leading cause of death globally. 1 in every 100 deaths is a death by suicide, and strikingly, there are more deaths every year by suicide than there are by malaria, HIV, and breast cancer, or war and homicide combined. Despite being a perennial human tragedy and a dedicated priority of both government and research institutions, at least since the end of the Second World War, this problem doesn't seem to be declining. And in fact, rates of deaths by suicide haven't declined, at least in the past 60 years. As such, we still don't know who's at risk when. Despite not yet being able to precisely predict who is likely to attempt suicide at what time, we do have some important hints. We know that suicide is multi-determined, so risk factors for attempting suicide or death by suicide across the lifespan include things like past non-suicidal self-injury, past suicide attempts, low socioeconomic status, and stressful life events, though effect sizes are small. But even in the most recent cutting-edge studies attempting to precisely predict who is most at risk near term, predictive power remains minimal, and clinician assessment is still just above chance. Taken together, this suggests that some facet of the suicidal pathway still remains elusive to understanding. But something that is consistent across nearly all theories of suicide is the understanding that suicide is an escape. For example, many influential theories of suicide have outlined how suicide is an escape from aversive internal states and external circumstances. So this we know. By contrast, relatively little work has explored what people think they are escaping to. For example, do people think that when they die, it'll simply be like going to sleep? Do they imagine that they'll be reunited with their predeceased loved ones? Or perhaps are they worried about being punished for misdeeds during their lives? Logically, we can imagine that the answers to these questions would influence whether or not someone views death as a desirable option in times of distress. And so as such, I've become really fascinated by this relevant yet understudied facet of the suicidal pathway in recent years, which I refer to henceforth as a person's death concept. But as you can imagine, this is a bit tricky to study because what people think about death isn't as straightforward as what they might think about financial instability or external stressors. While most people would agree that when I say financial instability, what I mean is not having enough money to consistently cover your basic expenses, what I mean when I say death might be very different from what someone else means when they say death. While most people would agree that what we mean is like the cessation of all corporeal functions and experiences, the consensus really ends there because death is presumably a one-trial experience, and therefore none of us have ever experienced it. So some amount of imagining is always necessary, and we typically get these imaginings from our unique cultural, religious, or philosophical understandings. And even in scientific accounts, like I said, some amount of imagining is necessary because none of us have actually experienced it firsthand. Once again, like I said, what someone believes an experience entails logically must influence whether or not they're willing to approach that experience. And so there's no reason to think that death is any different. Therefore, it would be helpful to gain a clearer understanding of what exactly people are thinking about when they think about death and how these thoughts make them feel. And I think that this would help us to better explore how people's thoughts about death might facilitate conditions for suicide. So despite the lack of clarity surrounding what people think about and feel about death, and the logical connection between people's death concepts and outcomes like suicide, very little work has sought to elucidate this. What work does exist primarily relies on binary and tangential categorical responses. While some direct qualitative inquiries do exist, they've rarely been analyzed, instead used primarily as a prime to get people to reflect on their mortality. In addition to being relatively understudied, what work does exist on death concepts is fractured among siloed literatures, particularly on the one hand in work examining fear of death, and on the other hand, suicidal phenomena. This is partially because of a lack of standardization in how we discuss and measure death concepts. And among researchers studying death concepts specifically, terms are abundant despite being definitionally or logically overlapping. For example, death anxiety, thanatophobia, and fearlessness about death, just to name a few. And despite all of these touching on people's thoughts and feelings about death, there has been very little overlap in these areas of work. So rather than building cumulative knowledge, findings are obscured by this Babelesque phenomenon, ultimately impeding progress. But I'd like to note that this isn't only an issue in this area of work specifically. Construct and measure proliferation are common in the psychological sciences. We can see here on the y-axis the number of measures published in APA psych tests, and on the x-axis, publication year. And while of course there are more measures over time, what's troubling is the exponential increase in this proliferation. And despite calls for more precise and standard terminology in suicide research specifically, this issue doesn't appear to be resolving. So in the second figure, we can see on the y-axis the rate of two different terms referencing suicidal phenomena. So in orange, we have the term suicidality, and in green, we have the term self-injurious thoughts and behaviors. And on the x-axis, we have years. And so these red lines here represent when a group of suicide experts came together to create and eventually publish a revised nomenclature for the study of suicide. And so in this nomenclature, they advanced that we should retire the use of suicidality and usher in a new era in which we use more precise terminology like self-injurious thoughts and behaviors. But as you can see here, despite a decrease in suicidality immediately after this publication, the rate has since continued to increase, and the recommended terminology has not kept pace. So, how can we move forward in studying the full suicidal pathway? Not only escape from, but also escape to, if A, we aren't actually sure what people think about when they think about death, and we don't have a unified terminology for discussing the death concepts that they have. To begin addressing this, we would need two things. A, an enormous amount of qualitative, textual data in which people richly discuss their thoughts and feelings about death, and two, a feasible and efficient way of analyzing this data. Fortunately, living in the digital age, we have both of these things at our fingertips. And so we scraped a Reddit thread containing nearly 27,000 comments responding to the prompt, "What do you guys think happens when you die?" These posts were made between March and July of 2021 and contain detailed descriptions of people's thoughts and feelings about death. To categorize these responses, we used the same method discussed by Layli just a moment ago, topic modeling using per topic, a technique that clusters linked text together to create distinct topics present in a textual data set. Now I know there's a lot happening here, but just bear with me for a moment. Leveraging these methods, we were able to identify 23 common topics which we labeled using a large language model. These are the same types of graphs that Layli showed just a moment ago, with representative topics on the y-axis and distinctness of these documents on the x-axis. We removed 2 irrelevant topics, leaving us with 21 final topics. But zooming in a little bit, we can see the kinds of comments composing each topic. So for example, in the fear and uncertainty about death topic, we see that people say things like, "That's a scary question. Has anyone ever heard of thanatophobia? I'm worried. This is a nonstop source of anxiety. And what's the definition of death?" And now I know this looks a lot similar to the graphs I just showed a moment ago, but this is slightly different. So what I'm showing here is the top documents by engagement in our data set. So here on the y-axis, we see the top topics by average score, that is upvotes versus downvotes of the comments making up that topic. And we can see that some of these include things like influential texts and figures in death discourse, postmortem legacy, mourning and emotional continuity, open-ended curiosity, end of existence beliefs, references of death as sleep, and things like this. But we weren't only interested in what people were saying about death, we were also interested in how they seemed to be feeling about what they said. So to explore this question, we applied sentiment analysis to each topic. First, we used Siebert to explore the proportion of comments within each topic that had a negative versus positive sentimental valence. Siebert is a sentiment analysis model based on the BERT architecture, fine-tuned specifically for classifying sentiment in text as positive or negative. So in this figure, we simply see how many documents received a binary assignment of positive or negative. Here you can see that the topics with the highest proportion of positively sentimented documents were those referencing pop culture, literature, and peaceful rest and acceptance. Next, we used Vader to explore how positive or negative the comments were in each topic. Vader is a lexicon and rule-based sentiment analysis tool that is specifically attuned to sentiments expressed in social media, and it's able to capture the dimensionality of documents. So, like I said here, we can see just how intensely positive or negative each topic is, rather than simply showing the proportion of positive or negative comments in each topic. So here we can see that the most intensely positive topics include peaceful rest and acceptance after death, and postmortem legacy, mourning, and emotional continuity. While some of the most intensely negative topics include absurdist humor and fear and uncertainty about non-existence. So we really believe that these results represent an exciting first step towards gaining a more comprehensive and holistic understanding of what people are thinking and feeling about death. We believe that to move towards a more cumulative and actionable understanding of these things, subdisciplines should move away from studying only their niche, specific death-related constructs towards this more holistic understanding of people's death concepts and how these impact behavioral outcomes. But there's only so much we can do with Reddit data, because we really want to be able, to connect these things to the outcomes we care about, like self-injurious thoughts and behaviors. So I am excited that we will be doing just that in an upcoming study, and we will apply the method discussed today to responses from interviews of individuals with past months' self-injurious thoughts and behaviors. And we'll ask them things like, what do you think about when you think about death? How do these thoughts make you feel? And how often do you have these thoughts? We will explore how different responses to these questions might relate to self-injurious thoughts and behaviors and contextual experiences over time, with the ultimate goal of updating theories of suicide. In this work, we'll seek to obtain responses from a more diverse sample than is thought to be present on Reddit, and we'll also need to be able to explore how the same beliefs about death might facilitate suicide for one person, but buffer it for another. We know that suicide represents an escape for many people, and we routinely ask them what they seek to escape from. But I hope what I've convinced you of today is that the opposite side of the equation is equally important, and suicide researchers should explore whether what suicidal individuals believe they're escaping to represents an attractive experience that they'd like to pursue in the near term. So with that, I thank you all